Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Nice to be with you all this morning. Thank you once again to Susan, who provided the snacks and breakfast once again this morning. So just a reminder, if folks want to help nourish us physically in the morning, just let Susan know, and you can bring muffins, fruit, snacks. It doesn't have to be a full-on breakfast, just something to nosh on. So thank you to Susan for doing it 2 weeks in a row. Thank you to Malik for setting up this space, and to Rabbi Jensen for gabaying for the virtual folks. Hi, virtual folks. Let's get started with the bracha, the blessing upon learning Torah together, which ends with la'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Thank you, God, for the opportunity to immerse together in these words of Torah. So last week, we try to make each class stand on its own, and this class stands on its own, but it's in some ways a continued exploration of the character that we were introduced to last week, the character of Rabbi Akiva. So just as a brief reminder, the text that we were looking at last week was actually the text about the end of his life. We didn't actually look closely at the final paragraph of that text, which tells the story of Rabbi Akiva's execution. We focused on the first part of that text, which shares that Rabbi Akiva was the one who defied the Roman decree around teaching Torah. He went into the public square, B'farhesia, and he taught Torah. He was jailed. He introduces the whole parable about the fox and the fish and the nets with Pappus ben Yehuda. And then, if you recall, we didn't look at this, but if you recall, the whole text was framed by this question around the Shema, in particular, the language of the V'ahavta, right? What is the difference between with all your might, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might? And Rabbi Akiva says that with all your soul means even if your soul is taken from you, you shall love the Lord your God. And the last excerpt of the text that we didn't look at is when Rabbi Akiva is actually being tortured, and he's smiling and reciting the Shema, and his students say, even at this time you're reciting the Shema, even at this time you're smiling, how could it be? Look at what your fate is. And he says, well, I finally understand really what it means, b'chol nafshecha, and I'm finally able to fulfill the obligation of loving God even as my soul is being taken from me. And so the final image that we are presented of Rabbi Akiva in the text about his death is one which uplifts him as thoroughly devoted and committed to the lifelong project of learning and teaching and fulfilling Torah. Okay, so that is the last image presented of Rabbi Akiva. But I figured it would be fun this morning to look at the other side of the story, which is the beginnings of Rabbi Akiva. Right? How does Rabbi Akiva become the Rabbi Akiva who is one of the best known and arguably most important rabbis of the Talmud? This is the Akiva who is mentioned 1,341 times in the Bavli. The rabbi of whom it is said, and I quote, "Things which had not been revealed even to Moses were revealed to Rabbi Akiva." Okay, you sort of don't get bigger praise than that, right? That's big, So Moses, of whom the Torah itself says, right, was the greatest prophet of all time. The Talmud says, yeah, and Rabbi Akiva had got on speed dial also and learned some things that even Moses didn't learn. Now, there are a few different tales about the origins of Akiva. Some are in the Talmud, and some are in a collection called Avot de Rabbi Natan. We're not going to talk too much about that. It's basically an expansion of Mishnah Avot, better known as Pirkei Avot. Right? Pirkei Avot is the collection of teachings which has sort of these short ethical statements. If I'm not for myself, who am I? The world is based on three things, and so forth. So in that collection, written around the same time as the Talmud, you have other origin stories of Rabbi Akiva. The most famous, I'll just tell you the one line of it. The most famous imagines Rabbi Akiva as a 40-year-old who knew nothing, who didn't know the Aleph Bet, let alone anything in Torah, and he sees water carving out a stone, and he asks, well, who is responsible for this? How could it be that something so hard could be shaped so profoundly by something so soft? And then he comes to the sort of conclusion, he deduces, well, God is responsible for that, and just as my heart right now is hard, the words of Torah, which are soft, can soften them. And then he goes off and he learns Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, Hey, and eventually becomes Rabbi Akiva. So that's the origin story told in Avot de Rabbi Natan. But we're going to learn the origin stories that are presented in the Babylonian Talmud, excuse me, of which there are two that share the same basic narrative arc, but include some different side points. So we'll move back and forth between the story in Tractate Ketubot and the story in Tractate Nedarim, and we'll see sort of what we learn from each, the new details that are added. Okay? You ready? Rabbi Akiva, text number 1, was the shepherd of Ben Kalba Savua, one of the wealthy residents of Jerusalem. The daughter of Ben Kalba Savua saw that he, Rabbi Akiva, or Akiva at the time, was modest and outstanding. She said to him, if I betroth myself to you, will you go to study with a rabbi? He said to her, yes. She became betrothed to him privately and sent him off to study. Her father heard this and became angry. He removed her from his house and took a vow prohibiting her from benefiting from his property. First of all, I just have to say, the text makes me smile a little bit because about a month into dating Ilana, when I was working on a farm actually in Maryland, I said, oh, by the way, I'm planning on becoming a rabbi, which was sort of like, now's your chance, but she stuck with me. So there's a little bit of a, if I betroth myself to you, will you go to study with a rabbi? There's a little bit of an echo of that in my own life. All right, so let's just make sure we understand this first text and remind ourselves of some of the characters here. So Rabbi Akiva, it's interesting, by the way, that they call him already Rabbi Akiva in this text, right? He's Akiva the shepherd at this point, and he works for someone named Ben Kalba Savua. Sometimes this character is just called Kalba Savua. Sometimes it's called Ben Kalba Savua. It's probably the same person, even though it's confusing because Ben means son of. But we've actually seen this character in one of our previous classes, one of the classes that Rabbi Brous taught. And it was in the class on the drought and the rain stories. And we learn that Ben Kalba Savua was one of 3 wealthy residents of Jerusalem who, during the Roman siege of Jerusalem, when the Romans decided what we're going to do is we're going to starve out the people of Jerusalem. They sealed the city. No food comes in, no food goes out, no people go out. And the text tells us that Ben Kalba Savua was one of 3 people who had enough food privately stored that he was able to sustain the residents of Jerusalem for 10 years. Okay, so he's actually introduced to us elsewhere in the text as both wealthy and generous, right? He does not, there's a little bit of hoarding his own wealth, but then he ultimately shares his wealth with people. And his name, Kalba Savua, I saw Elad sort of smiling in the back there because, Kelev Savua, you might recognize in the Hebrew, means a satiated dog, a satisfied dog. But elsewhere in the Talmud, it actually suggests that that's a compliment. Why was he called a satiated dog? because, this is an explanation in Gittin, because a person could go to his house as hungry as a dog and come out satiated. All right, so this is a generous and wealthy man, and yet, his actions towards his own daughter, right, cutting her off from any property, knowing that she's marrying someone who does not, or she's betrothed herself to someone who has relatively no possessions, right, he is endangering her. Right? His generosity is not being channeled towards his daughter and his daughter's new fiance. Now, one other thing I want to point out just about this opening is the daughter of Ben Kalba Savua, who is not named in this text, you might notice, who is not named anywhere in the Talmud, but is named in the Avot de Rabbi Natan text as Rachel, is the one calling the shots, right? She's very decisive. Right? She's the one who notices Akiva and who says to him, if I betroth myself to you, will you go study with a rabbi, right? She takes it as her own initiative to get engaged to this man, and she dictates the terms. And there is no other story, I checked this with one other source, there's no other story in rabbinic literature that shows a Jewish woman arranging a marriage for herself. Okay, so that should pop out. That should jump out to the reader as unusual, unprecedented behavior by a woman. There's going to be, I should say right now, a lot of troubling gender dynamics and gender assumptions in the text that we're about to read. Some that conform to what you might expect from 2nd century land of Israel, and some which maybe challenge some of those assumptions. This is one that challenges the assumption, right? That shows a woman acting with great decisiveness and assertiveness. Now, what do we know about Akiva prior to this story? The short answer is nothing. We know very little. There are a few statements over the course of the Talmud which will put us into the voice of Rabbi Akiva, sort of reminiscing or reflecting on his life before he was the great Rabbi Akiva. What we know just from this text is that he's a shepherd, right? And that his economic situation is likely not great, right? We know that he likely does not have a whole lot of Torah knowledge. However, he is modest and outstanding. We don't know what actions, what behaviors Ben Kalba Savua's daughter saw that leads her to this conclusion, but that's what we know thus far. So I want to now jump to the other Rabbi Akiva origin story in the Talmud, which is in Masechet Nedarim, and we're going to learn a little bit more about Akiva's economic situation at this moment. And as I said before, these two stories follow a similar narrative arc, but splash in different details that flesh out the stories in different ways. Rabbi Akiva became betrothed to the daughter of Bar Kalba Savua. Bar and Ben are synonyms. Bar is Aramaic, meaning Ben. Right? Bar mitzvah is like Ben mitzvah, right? Bar, son of. So by the way, this text tells us nothing about what she noticed in him, tells us nothing about what he was doing at the time, just brings us right into her moment of assertiveness. Although actually this one just uses the passive voice, right? It doesn't tell us who initiated. When Bar Kalba Savua heard about their betrothal, he took a vow prohibiting her from all of his property. Despite this, she went ahead and married Rabbi Akiva. In the winter, they would sleep in a storehouse of straw, and Rabbi Akiva would gather strands of straw from her hair. He said to her, "If I had the means, I would place on your head a Jerusalem of gold," which is a type of crown. All right, so what we learn from this story about their economic situation is that they are quite poor, right? So poor that they sleep in a storehouse of straw during the winter. And there's something very interesting about the image, right? He's gathering strands of straw from her hair, which maybe implies there's something actually quite romantic about it, kind of sweet about it, right? But also, some of you don't think so. I see in your facial expressions. You're like, that's not my definition of romance, right? Leave the straw in my hair, right? I mean, they sleep in a storehouse of straw, right? So I think the most literal understanding is that the straw is in her hair from her night's sleep. But maybe it's also a limited commodity, and we don't want that straw to go to the waste. He's picking it, but he's imagining, right? This, if I had more money, here's what I would do for you, right? He's sort of fantasizing about their future, but clearly they're quite poor, and still seemingly under the general auspices of her very wealthy father, but not benefiting from his wealth because of the vow that he took, right? And I should say, vows are very serious business in Talmudic and rabbinic literature. Annulling a vow is a extremely sort of difficult and laborious process. The rabbis really go to great lengths to try to prevent us from making vows, right? Because of how serious the implications are of making a vow and how hard it is to annul them. A note about this Jerusalem of gold. From the research that I did, here's what I learned. This is expensive jewelry, a tiara that uses the turreted outline of ancient city walls to form its shape. You're going to find this on statues depicting goddesses, especially the patron goddess of a particular city. And it was given, this piece of jewelry, to women who were civic patrons of institutions in a particular community. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of the Lion of Judah pin, if you know what I'm talking about, which I think is a Federation gift of jewelry for wealthy patrons, for women in particular. Right? But civic patrons of institutions, right? So it was a gift to sort of acknowledge thanks for helping to lift up or fund some institution in a community. The scholar Susan Marks wrote in her analysis of this story that not only is Akiva's fantasizing of giving his wife this gift a sign of private romance, but a symbolic indication of thanks for her being Akiva's patron, supporting his efforts to study Torah, which is a communally valued activity, which we'll see in just what you heard, right? She said, I'll marry you if you go study Torah, and we'll see just how much Torah he ends up studying. So it's a gift that also acknowledges her sort of funding of his scholarly enterprise. And just a sort of fun side note to show you what the gossip of the time was. Take a look at the next text. This is from the Yerushalmi, from the Jerusalem Talmud. This is now years later when Rabbi Akiva is quite wealthy. Rabbi Akiva made for his wife a city of gold, likely a synonym for Jerusalem of gold, which made Rabban Gamliel's wife jealous. He said to her, Rabban Gamliel says to his wife, did you ever do what she did? She sold her braided hair, gave the money to him so he could study Torah. Okay, so beyond just the kind of, quasi-humorous, quasi-misogynistic gossip tale being told by the Yerushalmi here about, women expressing their jealousy over who has what jewelry and who doesn't, and Rabban Gamliel's kind of rude response, what we learn is that Akiva's wife, in the state of poverty that they were living in, really didn't have the money to sustain Rabbi Akiva in these years of study. And so she cuts off her hair, right? And then sells it and then uses that money, right? The same hair that Rabbi Akiva is picking straw out of, right? She's wearing the crown that he fantasized giving her someday. Okay, let's just pause for a moment and take a couple of reflections on what you're noticing in the story thus far. What do you either know about any of the characters that you didn't once know, or what do you not know about them based on what we've learned so far that leaves you with a question about who these folks are? Keith.
Well, first of all, I think it is very romantic.
Thank you, Keith.
And domestic.
Thank you. I agree.
Really. It reminds me of a story by O. Henry called The Gift of the Magi, where as part of the ending, the wife cuts off her hair, and he gives her a comb to comb her hair. So it is very romantic.
Thank you, Keith. I agree. Gary. One second, Gary. Malik has the microphone just so the virtual folks can. There you go.
Do you think that Ben Kalba is angry and disinherits his daughter? That's a pretty extreme thing, because Akiva took the vow to be a rabbi, or because she did it privately without his consent?
Good question, right? So what motivates Ben Kalba Savua's extreme decision to, so he's the one who makes the vow, right? To make the vow to cut off his daughter from any, economic prosperity. Is it the manner in which his daughter became engaged to Rabbi Akiva, i.e. privately, or does he have some distrust or hatred towards rabbis and the fact that her daughter is going to be married to a rabbi? We don't know, although, Ben Kalba Savua in other texts seems to interact well with rabbis. I have the benefit of knowing where this text goes a little bit. We're going to see, I think we'll see that he does have respect for rabbis, but so maybe it's more, another option, right, is that it has to do with economic status, right? That he's unhappy that his daughter is marrying at an economic status so disparate from their own. Recall, by the way, right, that, as I said before, it is remarkable and unique that she is the one who initiates the betrothal. Usually, this was done between father of the bride and either groom or father of the groom, and that there was an economic exchange, right? So that the father of the bride could have expected some monetary compensation. I mean, he gave a lot of money, but he could expect some monetary compensation from the groom or the family of the groom, and Akiva seems to not be able to contribute that. So there could be economic disdain that's driving his vow. Hannah.
Yeah, first off, I was thinking, like, why would she inherit, like, the daughter, even inherit?
Yeah.
Secondly, I think you're right, I was thinking about that exchange, that who knows, maybe he already had designs on some partnership for her that she sort of took away. In terms of the straw in the hair, I was thinking about how he's kind of keeping her from being shamed for her decision to be with him, because even though they're sleeping in the straw, he's taking the time to sort of remove the straw from her hair, which she might not be able to see, so that she can go about her business and not make it obvious that she is, sleeping in the straw. And then I think this idea of him eventually kind of achieving this goal, it's like, it really, I do think it's a little romantic. And then finally, I was just in Tiberia about a month or so ago, and we were doing this, there was a marathon, but we did a 5K, and there was a big sign, Kever Rachel. I was like, Kever Rachel, that's not here, but it was actually his wife's tomb that I guess is in Tiberia.
Fascinating. So I want to just, I was going to say pull out, but I don't want to, we'll let the straw do that. Just one piece of what you said, right? So I said before in the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, she's not named, but elsewhere she's named Rachel. Rachel is the Hebrew word for you, E-W-E, right? Akiva is a shepherd, right? So some scholars suggest, right, that part of the romance of Akiva and Rachel is the romance of a shepherd with his sheep, which some of us here might not Might not feel like, man, Rabbi Panitz has a weird sense of romance. That's our takeaway from today's class, right? But you have to understand that shepherd and sheep is a metaphor used throughout the Bible and throughout rabbinic literature to actually speak of divine love, right? God, Adonai roi lo echsar. God is my shepherd, I shall not want. The Jewish people are God's flock, right? A shepherd has to be very attentive to the needs of their sheep. A shepherd accompanies the sheep when they go out to graze. There's a kind of a intimacy and attentiveness that the shepherd has for his sheep that maybe we see in this dynamic between Akiva and Rachel, so much so that he's attentive both to the straw in her hair and to what she's accustomed to, right? The standard of living that she's accustomed to, and so it's not kind of a vain thing that he's saying. He's trying to, there's a dignity in helping her live the life that she is used to living. Mary, and then we'll move on. Oh, sorry. Yes, Lisa and Mary, and then we'll move on.
I'm a little angry because behind every great man, there's a great woman. And I'm wondering why she has to express her capabilities through her husband so deeply. And I would like to know her name. I'd like her name to be more prominent. I would like her to be more prominent. And I'm wondering, maybe Rabbi Akiva got all of this stuff from her.
Okay. I'm just going to put a big old pin in that, right? Because we're going to come back to that. And I just for now want to acknowledge, as I said before, about the sort of gender assumptions, gender norms of the text, right? It's worth saying, right? This is a text written 1900 years ago, which by men, for men, which does a lot of damage in erasing women from the story and in erasing women's contributions to the story, and in many ways creating invisibility, right, for women, even in the success stories of men that seem to be only possible because of the women in their lives. So it is a necessary critique of the text, but I want to hold on to her role as we continue to move on in the text. Mary.
Because it seems to me like his generosity comes when he vows to remove her from all his riches. You know, you say he's generous, but like, what else is he going to do when he dies if she's it?
Yeah.
And it also speaks to why, you know, the idea that women don't inherit.
Right.
If she's all he has.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to the question. I'll look it up and let you know next week. I don't know if he had other children. Quickly, Marshall.
This is a question, because I can't get past the fact that he made a vow
Yeah.
to disinherit her. And I just want to hear what you have to say. I mean, that's so extreme.
Yep.
I swear before Almighty God that I want nothing more to do with my daughter.
Yeah. It is extremely extreme, and we're going to see just how extreme it is later in the story. Okay? All right. Shall we? Okay, so we are back in Nedarim. So this is now, right, picking up where we just left off, where Akiva says, I would place on your head a Jerusalem of gold. Elijah the prophet, remember him? He was in the first class I taught. I mean, he's famous for other reasons, but he was also in the first class that I taught. Came and appeared to them as a regular person and started calling and knocking on the door. He said to them, give me a bit of straw, as my wife gave birth, and I do not have anything on which to lay her. Rabbi Akiva said to his wife, see this man who does not even have straw? She said to him, go and be a student of Torah. He went and studied Torah for 12 years before Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. So in the Nedarim text, we didn't yet have the instruction for Akiva to go and study Torah, right? In the Ketubot text, it was her condition of marrying him, right? In this text, it's really interesting how it emerges, right? Is she saying it because of what she sees in Akiva's response to Elijah, right? She sort of sees this remarkable man, right, who understands that, yes, they're poor and impoverished, but here's someone who has less and we can give to them, and that sort of triggers for, I'm going to call her Rachel, right? That sort of triggers for Rachel, this man needs to go and cultivate that greatness which is inside of him by studying and learning Torah, right? Or is there something else? Has this been brewing all along, right? We don't know. We don't know what the two of them have been talking about, right? If he's been begging to go and learn Torah for some time, and this is the catalyst that makes it happen, right? But nonetheless, right? Elijah shows up, as he often does in rabbinic literature, disguised to the poor, sometimes to rabbis when they are in trouble, and there to teach some moral lesson or to help the people involved learn some moral lesson. And Rachel, once again, is the one who takes action, but maybe we see some of that modest and outstanding character referred to in the first text. I'm gonna keep going because I'll tell you why. Last class, I told you, I'm not sure if we're going to get to the end, but it's sort of okay if we don't get to the end because it's a separate thing. This class, I think the most interesting text is the last two texts, which is a challenge to myself because we have to get there, okay?
Did he get the straw, though?
Did who get the straw?
Elijah.
Yes, it seems that then Rabbi Akiva and his wife gave the straw. Yes. That would be a real letdown if, after all that, he doesn't get the straw. Good question, though. Okay, back to Ketubot. So the last thing that happened in Ketubot is Ben Kalba Savua cuts them off, right? Cuts them off. But Rachel had already said, you're going to have to go and study Torah, right? That's the condition of marrying me. Rabbi Akiva went and sat for 12 years. This is a long text. I'm going to read the whole text. There's a lot to unpack, but I want you to get it all in one shot. Rabbi Akiva went and sat for 12 years in the study hall. When he came back to his house, he brought 12,000 students with him. And as he approached, he heard an old man saying to his wife, "For how long will you lead the life of a widow, of a living man, living alone while your husband is in another place?" She said to him, the old man, "If he would listen to me, he would sit and study for another 12 years. How you doing, Lisa? You're okay, okay. When Rabbi Akiva heard this, he said, "I have permission to do this?" He went back and sat for another 12 years in the study hall. When he came back, he brought 24,000 students with him. His wife heard and went out toward him to greet her. Her neighbors said, "Borrow some clothes and wear them." She said to them, take a deep breath, Lisa, "A righteous man understands the life of his beast." When she came to him, she fell on her face and kissed his feet. His attendants pushed her away, and he said to them, "Leave her alone. What's mine and yours is hers. Sheli v'shelchem shelahu." In the meantime, her father heard that a great man came to the town. He said, "I will go to him. Maybe he will nullify my vow, and I will be able to support my daughter." He said to him to ask about nullifying his vow. He came to him to ask about nullifying his vow, and Rabbi Akiva said to him, "Did you vow thinking that this person would become a great man?" He said to him, "If I had believed he would know even one chapter or even one halacha, one Jewish law, I would not have been so harsh." Akiva said to him, "I am he." Ben Kalba Savua fell on his face and kissed his feet and gave him half of his money. Okay. There's a real sort of fairy tale, sort of folk tale, fairy tale dynamic going on, right? I mean, you can sort of maybe even hear some of the echoes. We heard one of them earlier, echoes of other stories. I mean, there's the, princess locked in the top of the tower and the poor man trying to, win her over. There's sort of full transformative character arcs, right, for so many of the different characters in this story. Let me just name one or two things, then I want to hear what you have to say about this text. Naming different characters that we are introduced to. We have Akiva, his wife, the unnamed old man, the unnamed women in the neighborhood, we have Akiva's students, Ben Kalba Savua, along with 2 time frames, right? Sort of the 12-year mark and then the 24-year mark. And we have different perspectives, right? We see the world through Akiva's eyes, through Rachel's eyes, through the student's eyes, through Ben Kalba Savua's eyes, through the old man's, right? The text is doing a lot in terms of characters, perspectives, and time frames. We have a fair amount of incorrect assumptions being voiced in the text, right? The students, right, who assume that this woman, who they don't know is Akiva's wife, needs to be pulled off of him, right? So who is this woman at our master, our teacher's feet? Get her off of him. Right? There's an assumption being made by the students. A really interesting one, which is where we're going to go next. Okay? We have the assumption of the old man, although that's the assumption that we might identify with most as modern readers, right? You're a living widow, right? How long are you going to continue to do this, Rachel? Your husband away for 12 years. This is not okay, right? I say assumption, though, because that's not how she feels. If he would go for another 12 years, all the better. Kal v'chomer. He should go learn more. We have the incorrect assumption of the women of the neighborhood. A great man is coming to town. You got to dress up a little bit, right? Don't go in your rags. And then that's when she says, a righteous man, knows what it is and understands the life of his beast. Okay? So I want to name some of the different assumptions in the text that are all proven to be incorrect, false assumptions. And then I just want to acknowledge the problems of the text for the modern reader, right? How difficult it might be for some of us, right, to sort of be presented with the image of the self-sacrificing wife, abandoned for 24 years, while her husband is off, becoming the great Rabbi Akiva. What might feel offensive about Rachel calling herself a beast in relation to her husband. I think that there's you see a lot of the gender norms of the time at play in ways that I imagine, for me at least, feel problematic to the modern reader. Okay, that's what I wanted to name, and now I want to hear your analysis of the text. What moves you? What disturbs you? What questions it brings up for you? David.
Just a quick question. The association of poverty and study, the tradition of that, where does that come from?
Can you ask the question again?
There's an implication that there's something righteous and meritorious to be poor and study.
Well, there's certainly something meritorious to studying. I think the text is more ambiguous about the merits of poverty. Well, I think we see both ideas expressed. I mean, there's later Rabbi Akiva texts which actually indicate that the fact that he doesn't come from merit, which could either mean wealth or a tradition of learning, right? A father who learned, a grandfather who learned, sort of works against his favor. He said, unlike these other rabbis, I don't have a peg to which to hang my hat on. So I think that we see both ideas expressed in rabbinic literature as a whole. One that poverty is meritorious, one that it's not. Certainly in the case of Akiva, it does seem to be an obstacle to overcome. And it's interesting, there seems to be a kind of indication here that you need a little bit of money to learn Torah. Right? That someone who doesn't have the means can't actually go off and learn Torah. I mean, his wife needs to sell her hair in order to fund his studies. She's living, and right, there's a question of the text, which is, he's amassing this great following. Is he becoming rich while he's in these 24 years? Why isn't he sending back money? There's a question around that, or if his wealth only comes later. This text, I think, seems to imply that the wealth doesn't come until Ben Kalba Savua annuls his vow. Okay, those were a couple of scattered thoughts. Jill.
I'm just
to disavow his vow, or because he didn't know who Akiva was. So what changed his mind? Do we know? Do we have some information about that?
Okay, we don't. I mean, what the text implies, though, which is, I think, we are, despite what I said about elsewhere in Talmud praising Ben Kalba Savua for his generosity, this text does not set us up to like him or to think favorably of him until the end, in which our picture of him is complicated. I think the fact that most complicates the picture is that he seems to have wanted to annul the vow consistently for the last 24 years. Right? Because he says, let me find it. Maybe he will, the last paragraph, his father heard that a great man came to town. He says, I'll go to him, maybe he will nullify my vow. Right? So he's wanting to nullify the vow. He's looking for a great man. He's looking for someone who has the authority, the legal wherewithal to annul the vow. So I think we're left, maybe it's not the full 24 years, but we're left to assume that he regrets having made the vow. He doesn't know that the person he's speaking to is Akiva. We learn in his conversation with Akiva, still not knowing that it's Akiva, that, and this is back to the question of why did he make the vow in the first place? Here it seems like he is concerned about the lack of Torah knowledge of Akiva the shepherd. And so it's not actually the economic disparity, but that he's concerned that his wife is going to be marrying someone who doesn't know any Torah. And then that's why he makes the vow in the first place. Again, just to say he's complicated. He's more complicated than he initially seems, and he seems to be interested in undoing the harm that he has done to his daughter. We might say too little, too late, but that doesn't seem to be motivating for him. Janet.
It's not lost on me that here is a wealthy man who wants access to someone famous or powerful. Would you always bring us something like that?
Okay. Wealthy man seeking access to someone with power. Melissa, then Annette.
I'm not sure I buy that it was because he wasn't learned enough. Because the thing is that she wanted him to go learn Torah. And you can learn Torah. That's not in his.
Yeah.
You can learn Torah. You can't have money if you didn't work for it. So I feel like there's still a class issue.
Okay. Good. Yeah. I mean, we are. It is fair to question Ben Kalba Savua's motivations and even the honesty of his dialogue with the great man. He doesn't yet know that the great man is Akiva, right? But if he's looking for someone to annul his vow, he's looking for a rabbi, right? And so, what might a rabbi want to hear? What were your intentions when you made the vow? Oh, he wasn't learned enough, Rabbi, right? It's fair to question the genuineness of Ben Kalba Savua, right? And again, I'll just bring us to, he is a satiated dog. We interpreted that the first time as an expression of his generosity. You could certainly read it a different way, right? That there's a kind of a bloatedness, a greediness to this character. Annette?
You asked what moves us, and what really moves me about the story is that in such a misogynistic time, and when this is really by rabbis and for rabbis, and the rabbis who are scholars of Torah discussing this, the impetus for the study of Torah comes from Rachel. I mean, she's the one, it's like the opposite of your origin story with your wife. You're the one who said, I'm going to be a rabbi, or you're going to hang in there. And here she's saying, I will only become engaged to you if you become a rabbi and do it another 24 years. I think that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to build on Annette's comment. So I saw a couple of hands go up. Are they in different directions, or are they building on Annette's comment? Building? So Elad, let's hear from. They say in the Gemara that the Talmidei Chachamim, that the real scholars, sometimes out of modesty, sat at the very back of the room.
I think this is a story about Rachel. Like that she is the main character here, not only Akiva. She was the one that identified the potential, to be Akiva. She saw him as outstanding she was pushing him to study Torah. This was probably at a time where Judaism was at its lowest point, and you needed more great rabbis to study Torah. She's the one who gave her hair so they could be warm at night and sleep comfortably. She is the main story here. There's, by the way, an amazing book by it's called The Orchard.
Yeah.
By Yochi Brandes, which is talking about this Akiva story from Rachel's perspective, and it's really worthwhile.
Okay. Agree. Amazing book. Available now in English translation, and you can listen to the Audible on Liddy, or you can listen to the book on tape on Libby. What's the right parlance these days? You can listen to the ebook on Libby. It's called The Orchard. I think that's what the English translation is as well. Yochi Brandes, and it's phenomenal, and it builds out these midrashim, and as you said, it takes Rachel's perspective. But I wanna amplify what you just said, right? Who is this story actually about? Is the story about Akiva, extolling Akiva's greatness? 12,000, 24,000 students, the great Rabbi Akiva, right? Or is the story about the greatness of Rachel? Now, we can still criticize a sort of a genre or a style of storytelling or a worldview that praises the woman in this way or by virtue of the sort of successes of her husband. I'm not trying to sort of undo that critique, right? But Akiva's comment to his students, right, when they are pulling her off of him, get away from our teacher. Who are you? Right? Is, I think, the moral of the story, and is profound statement, all the more so in the world in which this story is written and the world in which this story is received. Sheli v'shelchem, what's mine? All the Torah, all the learning, all the greatness, sitting at the lectern, preaching to the people. And what's yours, my students? All the Torah you learned, the status that you've attained, doesn't belong to me, doesn't belong to you, it belongs to her. Okay, now I have to take us into the next part. So there are a few hints that the story which is seemingly extolling Rabbi Akiva is also criticizing him. So the first hint is not on your page, so don't read ahead. The first hint is not on your page. It's something that I just want you to know, which is that this whole story in Ketubot about Rabbi Akiva, remember I told you, right, the way that the Talmud is structured is that you have a Mishnah. So you have typically a halachic statement from the rabbis of the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, and then you have a bunch of commentary on that Mishnaic statement from the rabbis of the next 400 years. And it's a way of sort of exploring the law that is presented in the Mishnah and asking, okay, if this is the law, to what extent, up until what time can you say the Shema, who can say it, what does it mean, all that, right? So this story about Rabbi Akiva comes in the context of a Mishnah Ketubot 5:6, which is asking the question, how long may a husband, be away from his wife and not have sex with her? Okay, so what you see here in the Mishnah is 2 competing values, right? Judaism has the value of marital relations, I should note, both because of procreative purposes and pleasure purposes. And I will say that the responsibility of pleasure is female pleasure. That's what the Talmud says, okay? I guess we could talk more about that, but not now. I'm not sure I should have said that out loud. Hello, YouTube. Okay, so all in this is all in the context of, given the responsibility that a man has to have sex with his wife and to pleasure his wife, but also the value of Torah learning, how long can a man be away learning Torah and not home having sex with his wife? Okay? And by the way, this part asks this question not about Torah scholars. It goes sort of profession by profession, and there's different lengths of time that a man can be away from his wife depending on the profession. So a sailor or a fisherman, and it's really fun Talmud because it gets into, well, like, if he's a fisherman, he's going to be stinky, and so maybe he needs time to be less stinky. Okay, 30 days, maximum of 30 days that a Torah scholar can be away from his wife. 24 years, Rabbi Akiva is away. Now, in this section, 12 and then another 12. In this section, right? No, not coming home for Shabbos. Although the Talmud does say that is the ideal time. It says, well, when in the 30 days should they come? They should come on Shabbos. Okay? In this passage, in which 30 days is the max, you get all of these stories in the Talmud about rabbis who went longer than 30 days with disastrous, sometimes tragic consequences. You get the story of a rabbi who went more than 30 days, who was so busy studying Torah, right, doing the thing he was not supposed to be doing because he should have been home having sex with his wife. The roof collapses and he dies. There's another story of a rabbi who, it's been so long that when he comes back, he doesn't remember what his own house looks like, and he can't find his house, and then he just goes back to the Beit Midrash. There's another story of a rabbi who, it's been so long, he comes back, and he sees someone who is his son. He doesn't recognize that it's his son. He has a whole conversation, and then when the kid follows him back to the house, he says, what are you doing following me back to the house? I'm your son. And he realizes, whoa, okay? So you get a law in the Talmud, and then you get sort of the problematization, right? Like, and then what happens when that law is not followed? Now, I want to be careful here, because unlike those other three stories, we don't have explicit evidence in this story that Akiva, right, did the thing that those other rabbis did and had to face the consequences. If anything, Rabbi Akiva is maybe celebrated, right? He has consent, he has permission from his wife to be away even further. But that is, I think, one possibility that there's something off about Akiva's behavior here, that he's not actually setting the model for what ought to be done, okay? But more compelling, in my opinion, is what comes next. So now you can look to their next text. So Akiva's teachings are everywhere in the Talmud. So it's a little bit unfair to say, what is Akiva's essential Torah? It would be a little unfair to say that. However, Akiva himself says what his essential Torah is. So I feel a little bit more, I have the permission to sort of say what is Akiva really think is at the heart of Torah. So here we go. This is from Genesis Rabbah. Am I frozen? Is it because of what I said about? Okay. Okay. All right. All right. I'm going to go on. Is that okay? All right. Ben Azai says. Okay. So what's happening right here is different rabbis are suggesting what is the most important principle in the Torah, right? What is klal gadol b'Torah? So Ben Azai says it's one thing. Rabbi Akiva says the central tenet of the Torah is v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That verse represents the central tenet of the Torah as it teaches that you should not say, since I've been disparaged, let someone else be disparaged along with me. Since I was cursed, let someone else be cursed along with me. A very interesting interpretation of what's going on in love your neighbor as yourself, right? It's this kind of like, that's the most central tenet of the Torah, right? Because it teaches us not to sort of like be vindictive or not to be retaliatory, not to feel like, well, if my star is sinking, someone else's star should be sinking, right? If my greatness is being diminished, someone else's greatness should be diminished, right? There's a ability to love your neighbor sort of even when maybe you are not at the top of your game. Right? It's a sort of interesting spin on why love your neighbor as yourself is the most important teaching. Okay, so that is Akiva's central Torah, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Now, one of the other very famous stories about Rabbi Akiva, we don't know when in his life it happened, but the number of students maybe gives us a clue as to when it happens, is the following from Yevamot. Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of students, i.e. 24,000 students. When do we know that he had 24,000 students? The moment that he came back, right, after 24 years away to see his wife for the first time in 24 years. He had 12,000 pairs of students in an area of land that stretched from Givat to Antipatris in Judea. And they all died in one period of time because they did not treat each other with respect. And the world was desolate of Torah until Rabbi Akiva came to our rabbis in the south and taught his Torah to them. This second group of disciples consisted of Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. And these are the very ones who upheld Torah at that time. And I'll point out this story exists one other place, very similar, but with an interesting difference in language. Instead of saying that they died because mipnei shelo nahagu kavod zel hazeh, because they not treat each other with respect, Genesis Rabbah says they died because their eyes became narrow with one another. Eyes became narrow with one another. Rabbi Akiva, the man whose essential Torah is v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, has 24,000 students following him wherever he goes. They follow him back to his home where they haven't been, where he hasn't been in 24 years. They see a woman in rags kissing the feet of their teacher, and they pull her off of him. What are you doing? And then he says, what's mine and yours is hers. What's happening? What's happening with the Torah that Rabbi Akiva is trying to teach to his students? Any thoughts? We have time for, 2 answers, and then I'll give my theory. Have I lost you completely?
It does say that he taught the disciples. He taught them, the ones that saved him. He taught them to learn the basics.
Okay, so we're going to get, so Marshall said they didn't learn the basic Torah, right? They didn't learn the essential Torah, and we know that, A, from how they treated Rachel, and B, right, because of this terrible plague that then wipes them all out, because they weren't practicing the Torah that Rabbi Akiva said is the essential Torah, right? There's a way in which he's teaching it, but they're not learning it. He's teaching it, but it's only living up here. And when the time comes to practice the behavior of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, they're not doing it with Rachel. They're not doing it with each other. They're not doing it with their fellow students. And so there is an essential failure, right, in the educational transmission of the Torah that is dear to him, that he wants others to learn, that they're not learning. And then, as Gary said, there's this second group of students, and he tries again, and then I think the language here is very interesting. And they are the ones, he'emidu Torah ota sha'a, who not learned the Torah, who upheld the Torah. So Rabbi Akiva is forced to start again with 5 new students. And what he realizes is I need to teach Torah that isn't divorced from the reality of how we treat each other. You can't just learn v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha in the Beit Midrash and think that you're then going to go out there and live that life, right? Torah is only real and divine and alive if it's practiced in our daily interactions with each other. Otherwise, that Torah is narrow. Otherwise, that Torah doesn't actually allow us to see the expansiveness of the people in front of us. And so then, in the second try, those are the ones who upheld the Torah. Okay, so Lisa said, where is Rachel in the second story? We don't know, right? She's not in the Yevamot in the last text that we read. But yeah, right? It is part of the critique. I'm going to admit there's something a little sort of modern feminist about this reading, right? That suggests that Rabbi Akiva himself wasn't living the Torah of Yahavta l'reacha kamocha, evident in the way that he treated his wife. Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay. Program comms meeting. What do we do? Okay, we're going to take Marshall and Janet and Jeff, and then we're going to close. Marshall.
Okay, I'm not sure of the order of events, but what makes this story so powerful for me is that going back to the Ketubot, the long part when he finally arrives, is that it becomes a story of repentance and forgiveness. The father realizes, oh my God, I've cut off my daughter, but the path to repentance is blocked because I made this vow. And Akiva was in a position to say, no, after the way you treated me, or as it said here, disparaged me, I'm not going to forgive you.
Yeah.
But somehow Akiva found it in himself to forgive. And that's where the story, I think, is fantastic. And I just don't know at what point the 12,000 or the 24,000 missed what was going on.
Right. Good. Janet and then Jeff.
It seems like Akiva forgot to mention his wife during the 24 years he was away because they didn't know about her.
Right. Yeah.
There's a whole lot of Torah missing here.
Yeah. Right. So to Lisa's point, right, which is there a critique not just of his students, right, for not learning the lived Torah of Yahavta l'reacha kamocha, but is there also a critique of the teacher, right, who didn't model Yahavta l'reacha kamocha? And evidence number one presenting to judge and jury is how he treated his own wife. Okay, and Jeff.
What happened, what happened? Make it and it's said that everyone loves themselves.
Yeah, right. Good. I mean, right. Always the question about V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, right? What is self-love? What are the needs of self-love, and how do they translate into loving others? Okay, we are past time. Thank you for helping me get to the very end of the source sheet. And as we always do, we are going to conclude with Kaddish de Rabbanan. And so if anyone is saying Kaddish in a period of mourning, I'll ask that you join. And anyone who's reciting this can rise with me. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, na'amad divrach hirotei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon yomechon v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, b'gala u'bizman kari v'yimeru, amen. Yehi shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam omei omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach, v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnasei, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal, shemei l'kudisha v'yichur. Le'elam in kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata, da'miran b'alma v'yimeru, amen. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Talmidehon v'al kol Talmidei Talmidehon v'al kol man da'askin ba'oreita divyatra haden v'div b'chol atar v'atar Yehi lahon u'lachon shlam rabba china v'chista v'rachamin v'chayin arichin muzana richa u'forkana min kadam v'hon divishmai v'miru amen. Yehi shlam rabba mishamai v'chayim tovim alenu v'al kol Yisrael v'miru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav chuya oseh shalom alenu v'al kol Yisrael v'miru amen. Amen. All right. See you next week. Come back. Rabbi Brous is back next week, teaching Talmud next week.